Hey Bob, good to be back with you. We are in the summer that we're recording this. I don't know when this thing will actually come out, but probably sometime in the fall. But our last episode was with Sister Miriam James Heidland, and man, was that ever a blessing and an amazing time of just hearing about the power of God and healing. So what we're planning on doing today is to break down a bit of some of the things that struck us from her story. We're trying to be sensitive to the person in the moment of everything they're sharing and just letting people hear the story uninterrupted. And now's an opportunity, I think, for us to offer a little bit of teaching and insight about things that struck us from a therapeutic, healing, all that kind of stuff. So any initial thoughts just about the episode in general?
I mean, we both expressed it in the moment, but just the tenderness of her heart and just the beauty of her sharing and the courage that she has. I just think both of us were sitting there in awe at what Jesus has done with Sister Miriam's cooperation, just the intimacy that they experienced together and the beauty of that intimacy and healing her heart. That's just really amazing. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. I think, I said it in the episode of Sister's story just gives evidence and testimony to the reality that healing is real, transformation is real, metanoia is real, Jesus is real. I mean, just the thing she said, this just blows me away. She said, I couldn't even physically talk to somebody on the phone. And that was the beginning of her story. And now she publicly goes around and talks about her story.
Yes.
That alone is amazing. She was too wrapped up in shame and fear and all of that stuff. And now she goes around and tells people about that story.
It is absolutely amazing. As we're recording just this last week, and I encourage listeners to go and look for this, but she did a podcast with Matt Fradd and talked some more about her story. And wow, just amazing, amazing. And how powerful that message is to so many people. And yet how hard that was for her to get to that place because her journey's real and she's been so honest with it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point that you make, because that episode that she did with Matt was solid. And the thing that struck me is that in her process of healing, she's become quite formed in how healing works. Like she said, she's just devouring books upon it for her own journey. And she does accompany people and, the ministry that we all do together. But she's quite sharp, she's a smart cookie. And I don't know where that's a dumb phrase, a smart cookie. But anyway, wow. I've just always been impressed with, she's she just kind of she doesn't enter a room and go, let me tell you everything I know, but she's learned a lot about how healing works and nuances, beautiful parts of it,
Yeah. She just really has a great understanding objectively as we teach together.
Right.
All three of us, as we teach together, we're just kind of in awe at the wisdom that comes from her. And so much of it is because she's had to struggle for it personally.
Right.
And learn and grow and heal. And it just, when somebody speaks from that place of their own experience and their own hunger, it's just so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, that she is a good example of, the generic phrase street smarts, like she's learned about healing from her own story. She doesn't have a formal degree. You and I have the formal degrees and we've done our own work, but it just goes to show you how mature somebody can become in these areas of healing and how much you can learn about the human person by diving into your own work. I mean, just one little example that she mentioned, and then I know there's various other things that we want to get into, was when she was saying things about how sophisticated the coping mechanisms that we have as humans. And the word coping mechanisms is pretty common. I think people would, most people, on the subway or, on the bus or in the grocery store, they would understand what that means. Like, oh, I have a coping mechanism. But when you dive into your own journey, it's amazing how intricate and, she said, sophisticated our coping mechanisms are. And that just really struck me, because I thought, that is so true. And until you start diving in, you don't realize how sophisticated they are, how good they are. To reference the anatomy of a wound, coping mechanisms are often vows. That's a link, generally speaking, and how much we live based on our vows and reactions to pain. It's pretty crazy. Like, why am I so driven? Well, there's decent reason to think that might be a coping mechanism. It's just the stuff like that. Why do I do what I do? Sister's point is, it could be a really sophisticated coping mechanism, which is a bit alarming, because you can start to worry that everything you do is a coping mechanism. And that's part of the journey, is sifting the wheat from the chaff, as Jesus said, about what's truly authentically me versus what is something I've developed to survive that's a reaction to a wound. That's an intricate process, an important one when you think about sanctity.
Yeah, and sometimes it's only in the going through the process that those things become evident to you. And so It's not a matter of going and digging for them, but just a matter of allowing the process to reveal, and then the freedom that comes as we're ready to let those go.
Yeah.
But they were necessary before then. They were protection.
One of the things I think that you're saying there, Bob, that really I appreciate is the coping mechanisms were necessary in a way at a particular time because it helped us survive. And I think we have to be careful not to shame ourselves when we see that we have coping mechanisms as an adult that don't work anymore, but that we've maintained because we needed them as a kid. That's an important area. I learned to survive and do something as a kid that made my life work. Now it doesn't work anymore as an adult. What do I do with that? Because it feels like normal. It feels like that's the way I've always done life. Here's an example in my life is working hard. Part of my life was in growing up, and there's a good part of that. Working hard is a good thing. Strong work ethic, those are good things. But it can get out of hand to where I'm working to avoid emotion. And okay, where is that connect? Where did I learn to avoid emotion? And now work is a coping mechanism so I don't feel negative emotion. Now it's out of hand. Now the good thing has kind of gotten out of bounds. Yeah. Anyway, just as an example.
Yeah, and apply that back to sister in the story is, one of the coping mechanisms was not to acknowledge the reality of the pain of this, or to talk about it with anybody,
right?
Or to trust anybody with that place of her heart,
right?
So it helped, even though it created a lot of pain, it helped her get through and survive until she was ready. And it was really the relationship with first of all Father Pinto as the priest who befriended her, who allowed her to feel safe enough to even get on the journey with Jesus, but then her intimacy with Jesus that allowed her to trust enough to feel safe enough to let go of those places.
Yeah, I mean, just that point alone about, and we see this all the time. And so again, I think just listeners, as we were indirectly accompanying every person listening to this podcast, as part of the reason for the podcast, when Sister talked about trusting Jesus, who is a man who has authority and power, that's amazing. Because in our woundedness, it makes a lot of sense that we would project onto God the things that we suffered. And so it would make sense in Sister's story to project onto God that he will be hurtful, will abandon her, whatever. Those were her wounds. Sister actually even said that she anticipated being re-wounded by other people in the same way that she was wounded. And yet, God's intervention, his movement in her heart was slow and steady and reestablished trust. And that's amazing when you think about it, because God's capacity is off the charts, his power is off the charts, and so is his patience and his kindness.
Yeah.
We often don't give him that credit, that maybe the healing journey's been happening the whole way along, and we're just not used to somebody being that kind and patient. We're not used to somebody having that kind of discretion for our good. That's abnormal in our world.
So true. Yeah. And we want to get out of the pain. We want to get out of freedom. And so we want it to happen quick. But there's another part of us that says, no way, I'm not going there.
Yeah, right.
and it's that internal battle that he so beautifully respects and meets us there.
Yeah.
He meets us in our desire.
Right.
By coming close, and he meets us in our fear.
Right.
By not pushing us past where we're ready to go. And sometimes it feels like we're going past where we're ready to go, but we're really giving permission because he doesn't violate that sense. And so Sister kept emphasizing over and over the kindness of God, the patience of Jesus.
Right.
And you could just hear as she expresses that, the reality of how she's experienced that. It's not a concept to her. It's not even though she has a degree in theology, it wasn't a theological construct. It was a theology of the heart, as she said.
Man, isn't that, I just love that phrase just for a moment, the theology of our head and the theology of our heart. That's a good way to distinguish between what we profess with what we believe and what we actually believe. There's a concept that goes around, maybe people have heard of, called practical atheism. In other words, with your words at church, even if somebody said, what do you believe? You might say, oh, I'm a Christian, I believe in God, I'm a Catholic, whatever. But practically, we might operate as if there is no God. And so the way I live my life might be as if there isn't a God. And I think woundedness is one of those ways. And Sister actually articulated that in her story. She had deep pain and deep ache. And that's the storyline, I think, for most people. And maybe the pain barometer is in different levels for different people. But everybody has suffered and everybody has desire. And those dynamics are very important to be mindful of and not to dismiss. They're critical parts of the journey. There's various things that we could go into, Bob. So we're just kind of riffing off of, automatically the things that struck us about the conversation with Sister. But one of the things that right before we started recording, I thought it was really cool because when you thought about our episode and you thought about the conversation with Sister, you were linking it back to some previous episodes with regard to seeing Sister's journey, which, what is most personal is often most universal. And so seeing Sister's journey and how it relates to a lot of us and how that's articulated in the Theology of the Body, in particular, original man in the first section of the Theology of the Body. Break that open for us.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, if you haven't listened to our first series, it was on the Theology of the Body of Healing, and we talked about the three states that John Paul II talks about of original solitude, original communion or unity, and original innocence. So each of those is what healing looks like. Healing looks like restoring our relationship with God and our identity before God. Healing looks like restoring communion not only with God, but with other people. And healing looks like restoring and freeing us back to innocence and releasing us from shame. And, I was struck by all three of those things in Sister's story.
Right.
And I was just reflecting on that of, so much of what her healing was first in relation to God. And when you experience a wound like sexual abuse, there's a sense of, how did God let this happen? Was God even there? Is God even real? Is he there to protect me? And who am I with him? I'm alone. I'm not loved. I'm not cared. All the identity lies.
Right.
And so much of her story was sharing while the actual trauma is being healed. That's a fundamental part of the healing, is that relationship with him. And then secondly, she talked a lot about broken trust.
Yes.
And not being able to, there's two parts of herself. There's part of herself that she could be publicly and part of herself that she had to hide. It was locked in fear and mistrust and shame. And so she talked about what it was like to experience people who were safe, like Father Pinto, who loved her, and then being able to open. And, just for her to share with us as men requires a level of trust, and to share with the public. So there's all this movement with men and women in her life that she's learned to trust these deeper places of her heart, which is so much of her healing.
Yeah.
without even focusing specifically on the healing.
Right.
It's healing. And then in a specific way, focusing on the healing. The therapist that she had, that she was communicating with over the phone,
Right.
a woman that she could trust and begin to share some of her story with. When she later came and met with you, as she talked about, and, you as a man that she could trust, or where she began to come to our conferences and trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so many other places where that trust is developing and communion is being restored.
Mm.
And part of that is trusting yourself. When you've had a sexual wound, it's really hard to trust yourself,
Yeah.
and she talked about that as,
Yeah.
the way you feel like your body's betrayed you by pleasure.
Yeah.
And learning to trust in that way again. And that ties into the third thing, which is shame, and, there's a lot of shame around all of that even though somebody who's sexually abused isn't the one who causes the abuse, there's a shame for the way your body reacts. There's a shame of needing to hide. And so much of the process that she talked about was that being honest little by little, coming and breaking through the shame little by little, and coming to see herself through God's eyes, and then seeing herself without shame, to be able to accept her body, to be able to accept her soul, her person, her choices, her affections, her desires. Yes. All of that is overcoming shame. And I think that's in every one of our stories.
Right.
But she spoke about it so tenderly and honestly.
Yeah. And what I appreciate about what you're saying, Bob, are the categories are helpful, because at some point, it can feel like you're out in the middle of the woods with no direction. You don't know, north, south, east, west, but somehow you're trying to find home again.
Yeah.
And that's why these categories are helpful. Like, where do I even start? Like, what am I even looking for? What does healing look like? That's why we started with that original series, is because if we don't have an understanding of what whole human looks like, what the heck are we shooting for? We're all just guessing,
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate those. This really is John Paul II's genius that's coming out of an exegesis of Genesis. And then it's your and my breaking down that and applying it to the transformation process, to the process of becoming wholehearted, of the restoration of all things, including our hearts, our souls, our psychology, etc. By the way, psychology is the study of the soul. So anyway, That's literally what the word means. So the three categories again, I think, can we just say it briefly again? Because I think it's really a valuable linking point. So there's original solitude, which means I'm alone with myself, or I'm just me. And so the wound there is around
with God. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So very good. So I'm alone, but I'm with God. I'm not alone in the sense of there isn't another relationship available to me. So that's very important. And in that relationship is where I find myself. That's where I discover my identity. So what you're linking there is, and we see it in Sister's story, where her identity was assaulted and wounded because of what was done to her. So that was a category. So if I'm looking at, my story, if anybody's looking at their story, one of the categories is, how did it affect my identity, my experience of myself, who I believe I am, as well as who I believe I am in relationship to God.
And who God is.
There we go.
Right.
Right.
God's identity. Who is he in the middle of all that?
He's a tyrant. He's not present. He's whatever. Yeah. Or he's a loving father who somehow transforms really awful things. Honestly, this is where the culture, I think, really goes. If you break down a lot of the people's cultural response to how could God allow suffering? Right. They're right back at what we're talking about, original solitude of how can human in relationship to a supposedly a benevolent God, how can he let all this happen? Right. Yeah. We're right back there. And that's the space that all of us face. We all go through that. And Sister's story, I think, is a fantastic example of how something can be made somehow more brilliant. It seems too good to be true, but here's an example of what so listeners, I hope you're following us. It's like the outline in my mind is we have these three sections. We're in the first section of original solitude, which is an identity wound. But one of the things that Sister did about more glorious, like, honestly, Bob, this blew me away. And when I listened to it again, Sister actually said, I have no reason to doubt her. She was in tears as she said it. I want my abuser with me in heaven.
Yeah.
What in the heck? Like, that floored me. And she's sincerely in tears. And I think it's probably a mixture of pain and incredible love that she wants his restoration.
Yeah.
Before, there's no that kind of love, that kind of it's not, there's no opportunity for it to exist.
Yeah. And that did not come in any way quickly or easily.
Yeah, good point.
That was suffered over years and years and years and years, and years of forgiving and learning to forgive and learning to pray for. And so, yeah, it's an amazing fruit of
There we go.
her relationship with the Father and her coming to work through this.
That's a very good point, because what listeners saw was the fruit. What you and I have seen a lot of behind the scenes is the tilling of the soil and the painful growing that led to such a beautiful and rich fruit. And there's where we kind of talked about the before and after, right?
Yeah.
A lot of, in that episode, we saw a lot of the after. She
Yeah.
just talked about the before, but the in-betweens where all the good stuff happens.
Yeah. And I loved also that she was so honest, which there isn't any complete after. There's always a process of after.
Yeah.
And she's in process. And so, yeah, just that beauty of all the fruit of what she's already walked through and her humility of, I'm going to continue.
Right. Yeah. You could hear Sister, and I think this is one of the things that exudes from her, and we can compare it to Sister before. Maybe a lot of people don't know her before. I would say we got to know her earlier in her story. Her experience of being a beloved daughter, her experience of being a spiritual bride of Christ it's matured, and it just exudes from her now.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons why people are so drawn to her and feel so loved by her, is because of the restoration of those wounds of her identity in original solitude.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you were using the term, it becomes more brilliant. It's like somebody who hasn't gone through that doesn't have that intimate sense of who God is, because they hadn't had to struggle with it.
Yeah.
Or the awareness of their own self in the same way. It's like when we kind of just go through life and we don't deal with that level of pain, we don't have to wrestle for God in the way that she did.
Yeah.
And she has wrestled so deeply and so honestly with him that she knows him at a level that she couldn't have known him without. And that's what she's saying. I'm just so grateful for this whole process, rather than how could God let this happen to me, which is where she started, where everybody would start.
Well, yeah.
In that place.
And we saw her in a lot of those areas where she was wrestling with a lot of those beliefs, right? About the how could God and all that stuff. And so again, I think it's really important to highlight that it's not a, magic wand. It's not a snap of the finger. You don't rub the genie healing lamp and then poof, everything gets better. That's not reality. God loves process. If you look at creation as one of a revelation of his character and personality. He loves process, slow and steady. Okay, so that's kind of that part one. So part two, you're talking about original communion, and a dynamic there that's wounded is trust in relationship. And again, talk about a core dynamic. I would have, before you said that, if somebody said to me, what's the core premise of every relationship? I would have said trust. If you don't have trust, there's no way you have love, and there's no way you have relationship. It's like, we can't get much more basic than this.
Yeah.
So as a category, listeners, of where do I start? Where do I go? Well, identity, that's that first one we just talked about. Now we're talking about trust and relationship with others, not just relationship with God. These are like the basic building blocks of life. And that's where healing is going in and looking for the basic restoration of life. So trust, what strikes you about that, again, as we just break it down again?
First of all, and again, this is the bigger part of her story that she shared, which is her trauma didn't start with the sexual abuse. Her trauma started with her being in the womb and her mother wanting to abort her and giving up for adoption and foster care for a couple months, and then coming into the family and then keeping secrets about that. So trust goes back way early in her life, at the deepest place of trust,
yes,
of communion with your mother in the womb.
yes,
Trust is broken there. So by the time sexual abuse happens, I think she was 11 at the time.
Yes, that's right.
There's been all this unhealed, broken trust that even though her parents were loving and caring, with their own unique wounds and difficulties, but even though she had good adoptive parents, there was a place where her heart couldn't trust fully.
There we go.
Because of that wound and because of original sin for all of us, right?
Yeah.
But so that by the time that comes, I found this a lot, is that we become vulnerable to other abuses because of the previous places where we haven't trusted.
Mm.
And so we don't learn how to be able to protect and care for ourselves. But we also have this hunger, we have this relationship hunger, that without trust, we can be easily abused. We can easily be vulnerable in that way. And it's not in any way to blame. It's to say there's a vulnerability there. There's a weakness there, unchosen weakness.
Yeah.
And that's what gets taken advantage of a lot of times. Most abuse is a playing on those areas.
And the statistics, we know this from working with just sexual abuse a lot, is that the percentage of people who go on to abuse, it's like over 90% that they were abused. So you're talking about someone's vulnerable to a secondary trauma. I'm emphasizing right here that there's also the possibility that they perpetuate abuse. So the unhealed wound leaves you vulnerable to more abuse. It also makes other people vulnerable because of the unhealed wound. I mean, Sister popularizes this phrase, wounded people wound people, or,
suffering is not transformed, is transmitted.
That's it. And so that's exactly what the dynamic that we're talking about is, if you never learned appropriate boundaries as a kid because you were abused, this is what you mean on a practical level, your awareness of boundaries that keep you safe are lower. It's not your fault, but you're like more susceptible, and it's not your fault, but that's a reality. I think, I just for a moment want to acknowledge that sometimes facing our wounds can be really hard because it requires us to speak the truth about them.
Yeah. And just to reassure the listeners, it doesn't mean if you've been sexually abused that you're going to sexually abuse others. That's right. It's a smaller percentage. But what Jake was talking about is those who have been abusive to others have most likely been abused themselves.
That's right.
A high percentage of that. But even in Sister's story, as she would say in there were places where the sexual abuse probably led her to be vulnerable to the rape that happened later, and then to the sexual promiscuity later. That those things are related.
There we go.
And again, not by you caused this to happen, but there's a vulnerability. There's a susceptibility because of that woundedness and the broken trust that happens there.
Right.
And the hunger for relationship, the hunger for love, because if I can't trust, I'm cut off from love. So my heart gets into a defensive place of, I'm not going to open my heart to anybody, but I still need love and affection. And so it just puts you into a very awkward place of, I'm hungering for something I can't have, but this feels like love until it turns to be the opposite of love.
Bob, you just described really well what a coping mechanism is. I have a hunger that it's like deep within me, and yet I don't trust a normal way to get it. So I go to an alternative way to get a taste of it. That is exactly what goes on in our relationships with God. I would say most of the people that I've worked with who've suffered in sexual abuse struggle in their relationship with God to trust him. And makes a lot of sense. It's not shame. It's a reality that can be worked through and needs to be faced. And that dynamic of ache goes into our relationship with God. But if I ultimately believe God will not satisfy me, that is a very important route to leading me to all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
I may not want to totally do this, but I don't trust that God will actually satisfy me. So what other option do I have? So I find alternative means.
So little of that is conscious. We're not
Yeah.
sitting there consciously thinking that, but that's the
heart movements.
That's the heart movements. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's what Sister became conscious of as she pressed deeper into her journey, how much the sexual promiscuity and other dynamics in her life were because of earlier things that happened in her heart and to her that propelled and put her on a trajectory that was it's like she didn't choose it, but that's the trajectory she was on.
Yeah. In the midst of that, there can be so much self-condemnation in the midst of it. It's just another playing out of the shame, which we'll get to in a minute. But that's what's so beautiful about Sister's story, is her learning through Jesus's compassion, through Jesus's kindness. Yeah. Again, going back to the original solitude, it's that relationship with God that ultimately heals that trust and that sense of, I don't have to sit here and hate myself for this. I can understand and have compassion for myself, even though I hate the sin and the consequences of the sin.
Right.
Both the other person's sin against me, but also my participation in any kind of sin. I can hate that without hating me.
Yes.
And I can understand me, and I can have compassion for me because God has compassion for me, because God sees me this way.
Yeah.
And that helps with the third area, which is restoring that area of shame.
Yeah. Just right before we go there, one of the things that's very helpful for me that I use to describe that dynamic is a false self. All this stuff that's going on, it's not me in my original glory. It's not me as I was designed, because I've got all these dynamics. You've got these dynamics. Everybody's to some degree dealing with this. And so those ways that I seek life apart from God and have learned how and have a lot of coping mechanisms and live in vows, I call that my false self. It's a sophisticated development of me finding life apart from God, apart from what is true, good, and beautiful. And when Jesus says, unless you take up your cross and die, or if you die, you'll find life, he's not saying die to the good. He's saying die to the false self. As soon as you have that category and explanation of die to false self, all of a sudden he doesn't seem as cruel anymore. Because he's going, that dynamic of seeking life apart from God, it doesn't actually satisfy you. We have to let that die so that new life can come. I will do it with you. I will show you how. And in some ways, that is part of a healing journey, as things do die. Yeah. But it's the stuff that's supposed to, instead of the stuff that wasn't supposed to. That's where a wound, something is hurt, destroyed that wasn't supposed to be destroyed. And then we develop this false self in a response. Just one more little point there. When sisters were talking about restoring trust, which is the second category of original union, she described Father Pinto.
Yes.
This guy that came into her world and simply loved her.
Yeah.
And that was part of her healing journey. She talked about her growing in relationship with you and I. She talked about other relationships, that was a critical part of her restoration of this area. And the part I love, she wasn't in therapy when she met Father Pinto. He was not a therapist. Right. He was a loving, good man.
Yep.
And that was healing.
Yep. So much healing happens by living in healthy relationships with people who love God and are able to love at some capacity. And
Amen.
That's what she saw. That's what she saw with Father Pinto.
Absolutely. Okay. So the second, this third category, that was the second one. This third category is original innocence. And again, what is all this? This is pre-sin, before the fall, before humanity was distorted and disfigured by a no to God and how that ripple affected throughout, millennia. We originally had innocence where there was no shame. We weren't ashamed. We weren't walking around in shame. So again, if I'm thinking about healing a wound or addressing my past, we're laying out three primary categories here that we see in Sister's story. Who I am, identity, and my relationship with God. Trust, and my relationship with others. And third, the experience I have of shame and the experience of just innocence, where I'm not constantly bombarded with how awful I feel like I am and how terrible. Like Sister, one of the things that she said was she believed that she was dirty. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very, very common experience for people who have been sexually abused. That would be an example of a wound to original innocence.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
What any other links that you would make there with that third category?
Yeah. There's usually several that we run into as we're walking and accompanying people as they work through sexual abuse. That's one of them. I'm dirty. I'm bad.
Yeah.
I felt pleasure, so it must be my fault.
Yeah.
Pleasure is bad. My body's betrayed me.
Yeah.
I'm somehow damaged.
Right.
I'm tainted by this, and nobody can really love me here. Those are all symptoms of shame in some way.
Right.
And there is a loss of innocence, in a sense of innocence has been robbed when you're sexually abused. And then it's the reaction towards yourself in that continues to perpetuate, again, the identity and the sense of unworthiness and being unlovable because of that then blocks love. It becomes a shield blocking love, and it's both the mistrust that says nobody can be trusted, but even if they could be trusted, I'm not worthy of it and I can't trust myself.
That's really well said. It's like two layers of it. I don't trust other people, but even if there were, so I mean, I don't, Sister didn't say this, but we could almost play out her inner world of, I mean, Father Pinto is really great, but if he really knew me, there's no way he would really love me.
Yeah.
And there's where vulnerability becomes an antidote to shame. This has been popularized by Brene Brown, where she talks about one of the remedies to shame is vulnerability. Well, this is why, because if you're with somebody who's actually good and loving, truly good and loving, when you're vulnerable, they receive you. And so when you bring all of your mess to the table, you get a different experience than I'm bad, I'm dirty, it's my fault, etc. And there's a restoration of that.
Yes.
And in through relationship. And so when, like Bob, when you and I talk about vulnerability and people are like, you guys are crazy. I'm not going around and being vulnerable. Have you seen my neighbors? They're jerks. We're like, well, yeah, it may be that that's not the person to be vulnerable with. But if and when we find people who we can be vulnerable with, they're incredibly healing because we bring our brokenness and we're received.
Yes.
So look at it from the other side. Everybody's looking for somebody with whom they can feel safe and be received. The other question is, am I someone that other people can be safe with? Am I willing to keep my mouth shut instead of always give people advice? I remember people I used to work with, they would say their friends would try so hard to help, but they weren't helpful because they would go, well, you just need to ... or you just need to get over it, or you just need to. And I'm like, shut up, people. That is not helpful at all. Be present to them. Listen to them. Don't throw something at them. Here's how Brene Brown says it, and I really love it. If somebody shares something that's painful with you, what's required for you to connect to them is to connect to something in yourself that's echo-ish of their pain. You don't have to go through exactly what they went through. But when you've connected to that, you're much more likely to respond in a healthy and appropriate, loving way. If they say, wow, I'm really upset because my dad told me my whole life that I'm an idiot. Well, if you pause for a moment and go, what's that like? Wow, my dad never did that, but I had that teacher one time who said, you'll never be good at math. And I remember how hard that was to hear. I get kind of where you're coming from. And now I'm with you in it.
Yeah, that's great illustration. And only when you walk into those places of your own heart can you do that. And that's the beauty of Sister now. I mean, everywhere she goes, people are wanting to be with her.
Right.
We see it all the time because they can feel that. They can feel it's safe because here's a person who's walked through something and has been vulnerable and has faced the shame and is not going to shame me. And that's the issue. And we had this conversation the other day about how much we all deal with shame and how much when we don't face the shame, we tend to inadvertently shame other people. And it's the very opposite of that vulnerability. And that's what I've seen with Sister as she's walking through this, she just has such a heart of that kindness of Jesus, of that compassion and that mercy, so that people can come up and share anything with her. And it's because she's walked through this. It wasn't always that way.
It's very good. I think to continue to honor sister, as well as help people see that it's normal. As we were in a meeting the other day where some other folks were with us, and it was you, me, and sister, and it was one of sister's very good friends, and this person kept saying, and sister's not perfect, and sister's not perfect, and I was watching her smile as he was saying this, and he wasn't saying it shaming at all.
No.
But it was this beautiful, because we had just it was a setting where we were just honoring sister for all that she has done and who she is as a person. And this guy, while honoring her, was also saying, and you're not perfect. And she received it in love. It wasn't shaming. And how in the world was that not shaming? Because sister knew this person loved her.
Right.
And so he's subtly exhorting her to not get too comfortable, but at the same time, she's smiling about it. And that to me is an indicator I've experienced in my life where I knew something had shifted in my heart. It was a fruit of healing where I felt the Father, Abba Father, God the Father, correct me. And it was like we both chuckled while he corrected me, versus me being demolished or me getting defensive.
Yeah.
I just laughed and went, "You're so right. You're so, oh my gosh, you're so right." And he's still going, I love you, but that's not good, And I'm like, "Oh, you're right." There's that beautiful experience that's possible in the ongoing journey of faith where shame isn't the primary environment that we live in.
Yeah. And that's really, as you say that, it's really the freedom from shame that we can be imperfect, because if we have shame, then we have to be perfect in order to be loved.
Wow.
But if we're able to be loved in the midst of our weaknesses, then we can be imperfect, and everybody around us can be imperfect. So we don't have to keep ourselves or other people on a pedestal. So that's a good qualification there. As we're talking about sister, she would be the last person to say, "Don't put me on a pedestal." But we also admire the process that she's been in, and it's real and genuine, as everybody can hear.
Yeah. I think you said she's the last person to say. I think you meant she'd be the first person to say, "Don't put me on a pedestal."
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, that was kind of. She's the last person to say, "Don't put me on a pedestal." Put me on a pedestal, then.
Yes. No.
Yeah. Okay. So, Bob, any final thoughts about, just because we'll land the plane here?
Yeah, I'm gonna say something to generalize this beyond sister to all of us. In our culture, we have all experienced sexual abuse, and I know that's a very difficult statement for people to hear.
Okay.
But in the movies we've watched, and the television shows, and the language that we have, and the experiences that we've all had some experience of the disordering of our sexual relationships, whether it's in thought, word, deed, desire. And there's some abuse in that, whether it's self-abuse or abuse by another, or the abuse by the culture. Wow. And so everything we're talking about applies to all of us. It's to degrees how damaging and traumatic that abuse is. So all of us have shame around our sexuality by virtue of living in a fallen world. And so the things we're talking about here aren't just if you've had severe sexual abuse or rape. They're for all of us. And we can all learn not only from the general example of Sister's witness, but also from specific ways, as you were saying. Let me identify with the places in my own life, and then be vulnerable there with God. And where am I not trusting? Where am I living in shame? Where am I not seeing myself with God's eyes?
Wow. Bob, I've never heard that before, but that is so true. Like, that is so true. I'll springboard. My final thought will be, I'll springboard off of what you're saying, because as I'm hearing you say that, I can almost imagine people being devastated, and the response could be, why do you guys keep stirring up the pot? Would you just leave it alone? And I'm thinking that reaction is a really good indication of whether or not we believe God is who he says he is. And if I don't trust that there's really a savior, I don't want to face the reality of life. I can't.
Right.
But I can speak a truth like what you just said, if there is a savior, if there is a way out, if there is a way to restoration, even though it might not be easy, okay, but if there's a way, then I can be honest. And then the choice to live on the way or not is that's its own matter. It's not hopelessness.
Yes.
And I think that's something you and I maybe take for granted that I'm just aware of right now, is that we truly believe that there's a way and there's a savior. And so we can say things that maybe other people don't say. And I think our lives personally and our work professionally has helped us see the savior in so many crazy situations that we go, there's no doubt that there's a God. We've had front row tickets to crazy things that he's done.
It's just seeing that work. It's
right. And so
amazing.
It affords us this luxury, but it doesn't necessarily feel like a luxury of being honest.
Yeah.
Like what you just said.
Yeah. And so if somebody wants to go further in these areas, and we can put this in the notes, Dan Allender is an expert in this area. Sister mentioned him.
Yes.
So a book by him, The Wounded Heart, I believe is one of them. My book will be out by the time this podcast comes out, and I talk about the healing of sexual abuse and the 7 deadly wounds in sexual abuse.
Awesome.
And a story about how to deal with the trauma and come to the healing process.
What's the name of it again for everybody?
Be Restored.
Be Restored. Yeah. And there's some really good books by Jay Stringer, where he talks about just the areas of sexuality and neurology and stuff like that. So there's some good resources that are out there.
Unwanted, I think, is the one that I'm aware of. Unwanted.
Okay. Unwanted. Yeah. There's we'll do a little bit of scanning, listeners, and put that in the show notes of just various resources, because off the top of our head they may not be there, but they're there. This is a topic that people have dove into. But right, well, the first things that come to my mind, Dan Allender and Wounded Heart I've heard about that one for a long time, and some of the other stuff that we just mentioned. And Bob, honestly, that's a lot of the stuff that you do is a very popular point for people to turn to. So again, listeners, check those. But even going back to Be Healed, which is one of your I think it's your first book, there's a lot of basics in there that are applied to sexual healing. You're specifying in this latest book. But listeners, thanks for being with us. Just God bless your courage. Showing up to this podcast is not for the faint of heart. And so we just want to affirm you that, you're in it and you're with us. We'd love for you to share an episode that you've liked, or this episode, with someone. We're learning more and more that's a great way that people find out about the podcast. And so if it's blessing you, simple way to bless somebody else is just forward this on to them. We're also on Patreon, so we do special things behind the scenes for patrons. They get special content just from Bob and I that's specifically for them, and some other things as well. You can check that out. And we're just grateful for you, and we're grateful for you being on the journey with us. And we pray that you would continue to experience the abundance of God's love, mercy, and healing.